Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing the complete series of Claymore. Claymore is a series that I first got into in its anime form. A friend of mine, he was really into the manga Claymore, and he bought the anime version, and he was really excited to show me it, so we watched the entire series in like about 2 days. After that, I was always curious because I'd heard that the anime only adapted a part of the manga and that the ending was completely different to the manga. And so I was curious about how did the manga go? How did the manga develop? What was the ending of the manga like? Was it better than the actual anime ending? Etc, etc. So these are questions that I'm hoping to answer in this review. So let's get started. So first of all, what is Claymore about? Basically, Claymore is set in this world, a fantasy world I should say, where there are these creatures called Yoma. And basically these Yoma are creatures who can basically imitate human form. They live inside of villages, disguise themselves as a human being, are able to take the memories of those human beings they disguise themselves at, so that it's almost impossible to be able to tell them from another human. And basically they like to eat the guts of normal humans. And so when a Yoma begins appearing and people start dying in these villages hire a Claymore. Now what a Claymore is a warrior woman who is capable of being able to tell which person is Yoma and will then kill them with a giant sword, hence where their name came from, Claymore. The story begins basically in this village where we meet a boy called Rocky. And basically there is this string of killings going on. It's clearly Yoma, so they hire a Claymore by the name of Claire. And Claire enters the town, is able to find out which Yoma is killing, slays that Yoma, saves the town, and then leaves. But in the process of leaving, she ends up leaving with Rocky. And that's where the story begins. Now, as you can imagine, this story very quickly develops beyond simply going from village to village slaying Yoma, although admittedly near the beginning of the story it does feel a bit like that. And that's something that I should probably bring attention to. The beginning of this series isn't particularly superb. It's pretty slow. There doesn't really seem to be too much character development or too much story going on. And so those first 2 volumes, even though I'd seen them in anime form and actually found them slightly more engaging in anime form, they seemed a bit slow to me and a bit uninteresting. It wasn't until volume 3 where we started to get some of the backstory of some characters that I really started to get into this series again. And if I'm correct, the manga doesn't diverge from the anime until approximately volume 10 or 11. So if you are fans of the anime of Claymore, you will be very familiar with the story going up to that point. From there on, the story changes completely and is completely different to the anime incarnation. So you'll be able to get new story content from there. But until then, it's very familiar. That was fine with me. I was fine with refamiliarizing myself with that world of Claymores. So, how did I feel about this new content? My overall opinion is that I was very happy to read it. A lot of it I found very engaging. It isn't flawless though. There is a time skip at a certain point in the manga, and after said time skip, the story starts to become slightly uneven. Basically, we have a massive cast of characters, and we spent a lot of time going between them, and there are certain characters that I just found uninteresting, and so whenever volumes tended to focus on said characters, I started to find myself kind of losing interest in the story. But as soon as we go back to a character that I was interested in, that I was invested in, I would suddenly become a lot more invested in the story. So I would regard that as a bit of a pacing issue of the story. Beyond that, what did I think of the ending? How did the ending compare to the anime? Well, the anime ending was pretty bad, at least in my opinion. I know there are certain people who actually liked the ending of the anime, and in those cases, that's perfectly fair, but I didn't like the ending. In the manga, I was far more satisfied with the ending. Now, that isn't to say that I found it a perfect ending. There are certain few issues that I have with the ending, which I would say the ending kind of starts beginning around volume 23 and kind of lasts until about volume 27. So it's quite a kind of a long, stretched ending. And there's a few issues I have with it, issues that I kind of want to discuss with other people who have read this series. But overall, I found the ending much more satisfying than the actual anime incarnation. Now, I've spent a lot of time comparing this to the actual anime. For those of you who are not familiar with the anime though, I should probably kind of give you a bit more of an idea as to how this story is, what type of story is it. Let's start off by simply saying it is an action series. There's a lot of fighting in this manga, and you know, that's excellent. You know, I'm always up for a good, well done action manga. But no manga is able to sustain itself purely on action. And so there's a lot of intrigue in this manga. There starts to be kind of the revealing of some conspiracies. Things aren't quite what they appear. And I was pretty pleased with how that particular story thread developed. I thought it was a very well handled mystery. I thought there was a very nice pace to when the information was given to us. Overall, I was very pleased with that. Beyond that, let's probably talk a bit about the characters. Now, I have a policy of kind of only discussing what happens in the first chapter, at least in terms of characters and story, so as not to spoil much of the series. Problem is, only 2 major characters introduced in the first chapter, but let's talk about them a bit. Claire. So Claire is our lead character. She's the one that's on this cover. And Claire is quite an engaging character. She's kind of emotionally detached, kind of a bit stiff in terms of being able to express emotion, although to be fair, there are plenty of moments throughout this manga where you'll see her expressing a huge amount of emotion. Over the course of the manga, we start to find out a lot more about her backstory, the tragedy behind her, what her goal in life is, why she seems so emotionally detached. And I was very pleased in general with her character development, particularly in comparison to the anime. The only problem I would say in terms of Claire and her role in the story is that particularly later in the story, there are large stretches where we don't actually spend any time with Claire. So I just found that kind of disappointing, that for a character that is the lead of this series and that I'm emotionally invested in, later on we start to see less and less of her. So I did find that a bit disappointing. But overall, I like her as a lead character. I think she's a great protagonist. Now, Rocky, which is her companion, essentially. He starts out pretty annoying. In fact, a lot of people would say that in the anime incarnation, he is the most annoying character in the whole series. I will say, though, he fares much better in the manga. And that is mainly because beyond the point where the anime ends, a huge amount of character development happens on his part. Beyond the point where the anime ends, a great deal of character development on his part occurs. He becomes a lot more kind of rounded out. We are able to kind of figure out what his goal is more. He becomes a lot more interesting as a character later on in the series. Although admittedly he does tend to be a bit annoying early on in the manga. I was expecting him to be annoying, and I was pleasantly surprised at how well he was done later. So, pretty pleased with those 2 characters. In regards to the rest of the cast of characters, I do have to say, I think there's too many characters in this manga. Later on in the series, we have like at least 15 kind of main characters. Perhaps even more, depending on what you define as a main character. I just found that a lot of them were losing screen time to other characters, and that very few of them were getting the proper development that they deserved. So I do think that Norihiro Yagi should have reduced the amount of characters he had later on in the series. But overall, in general, with the cast of characters, I found them to be likeable and engaging, with a few exceptions. Now, in regards to the actual art itself, as you might expect from a 27-volume series, the art changes quite a bit from its beginning. In the beginning, it is a little on the kind of stiff side in terms of art. It's still relatively pleasant. It's a monthly series, I should point out, so there is a bit more detail than in a weekly series. So if I might give you a kind of an example of that. You know, pretty pleasant looking artwork, not particularly detailed, particularly not in comparison to a lot of other monthly series. Surprisingly large amount of negative spacing used, but, you know, a decent amount of detail. You know, it's kind of nice. My biggest issue with the artwork in the earlier volumes is the fact that there is a certain few scenes where characters look a little off model. If I might get you an example of that, an example might be this 2-page spread. As you can see from the guys, they just look a little off in terms of, you know, their body proportions, the length of their arms, the length of their legs, the positioning of their backs, etc., etc. And that is, I wouldn't say a relatively common occurrence, but, you know, it does happen enough in the first 2 volumes and part of volume number 3 that I did find it a bit distracting. Good to say that around the middle of volume 3 and onwards, he actually kind of sorts out that problem, which I was very pleased with, because later on in this series, there is some really, really gorgeous looking artwork. I mean, let's just say, take volume 14, and we just move on. The amount of detail is far, far greater in this volume than in those previous volumes which I showed you. And also something, this is probably the single thing that I would praise Norihiro Yagi's artwork the most, and that is he is sensational at being able to convey movement. Like, for example, let's just take this little panel right here. Look at the way that he has drawn those blur lines, those motion lines, to be able to convey the movement of the character. I think it's just simply breathtaking. He really understands that when there is a lot of movement, things blur. I always find that annoying in manga when things are moving, but they're still like pretty much perfectly clear. Because it kind of feels like as if it isn't moving that quick, it isn't moving that fast, might not even be able to convey movement at all. But Norihiro Yagi realizes that when things move, they blur, and he uses that to its full effect. So I found a lot of the action sequences really engaging simply because of how easily he was able to convey movement. It was just brilliant. So I really, really loved that style of his art. Beyond that, he does use a lot of negative spacing, I noticed, even though he relies on it less later on in the series. There is a lot of moments where you will see white backgrounds, and while that is a bit disappointing for a monthly series, I was able to get over that. So overall, artistically, I found the series very good overall. A bit iffy at the beginning, you know, decent but not brilliant, but as the series went on, it steadily improved artistically. And I guess the final thing to point out is Viz's treatment of the series. Now, there isn't really too much to say about Viz's treatment of the series. It's part of their Shonen Jump Advanced line, which is basically manga aimed at 16 and over. It's the same as a standard tankobon, so if I get my trusty Yotsuba, you'll see it is exactly the same size. You can't even see the Yotsuba. See? So, exactly the same size, it's standard tankobon size. And the only other thing that's worth noting, as with most of Viz's shonen releases, they completely re-letter the sound effects. So, as you can see, shove, there is no katakana or hiragana sound effects there. It's just, that's been removed and replaced with an English translation, which is perfectly fine. I always quite liked that aspect of Viz's release of shonen series. So, overall, what do I think of Claymore? I enjoyed the manga more than I did the anime, particularly due to the better ending, the way that we were able to learn a lot more about the world, how certain characters got a lot more development in the manga than in the anime. It isn't a flawless series, it does have pacing issues later, the art starts a bit iffy at the beginning, and the ending, though it's I would consider it significantly better than the anime's ending, does still have its share of problems. But I will recommend this to you if you are looking for an action series that has fantastic action sequences, that has engaging mysteries, that has well done characters. I can recommend this to you. And for those of you who have watched the anime and are wondering, is it worth investing in the manga, I would say yes. While the first 10 or 11 volumes you will be very familiar with, as they are pretty much directly adapted into the anime, from those point onwards, it's a completely new story. And it's well worth reading those volumes simply because of how much more we learn about the world and the characters in that section of story. So that's my review of Claymore. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.